مولانا أبي القاسم مصطفى محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
هذه الطيبين الطاهرين المذمومين المعصومين وأصحابهم المنتجبين. In the name of Allah, compassionate and merciful, all praise is due to Him, the Sustainer, the Nourisher, the Lord of the Cosmos. And we ask that He shower blessings and peace upon our beloved Messenger, Muhammad al-Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, and upon his pure progeny who guarded the message after the Prophet's passing. Dear respected elders, brothers and sisters, and the hope of the coming generation, the youth of this community, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we are gathered in these nights to commemorate and to remember the life, the movements, and the tragic martyrdom of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salam. Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. We gather each year to revitalize our connection to his legacy. We gather each year to revitalize our connection to Islam. And we gather each year to revitalize our connection to our Prophet. It's reported that the Prophet ﷺ said, Husaynun minni wa ana min Husayn. That Hussein is from me, and then I am from Hussein. And that creates a couple of questions in the mind of what does that mean? Perhaps in analyzing the movements of Imam al-Hussein, we'll find that perhaps that was an allusion, an indication to the future tragedy on the plains of Karbala. And that is because our Messenger sallallahu alaihi wa alihi took great pains and immense force to change the social norms and the customs of the Jahili Arabs of his time. He was given the duty to spread the deen of Allah to people who had forgotten the deen of Allah. He was the reminder for this community, and indeed he was a reminder for the world at large, for Islam in the Prophet's final message was meant to be a universal call to faith. And so in thinking about this, we should look at a couple of the ways that the Prophet struggled against the community of his time to establish Allah's norms and to revitalize the spiritual soul of the world at large. First thing we see is that fundamentally he came to teach Tawheed over and against Shirk. He taught the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala over and against the polytheism of the time. And so at first glance, that seems like that's a matter of theological quibbling. It's something that we might think of when we think of refuting the books of Richard Dawkins. You take one book against another book, and you go to the library and you think about it a little bit. But that wasn't the Prophet's job, alayhi salatu wasalam. Polytheism at the time of the Prophet was part and parcel of the culture of the time. So when we think about the Prophet's pains and suffering to change the world around him, you have to think of the difficulty that it takes to change one person's mind and then multiply that by thousands. The difficulty it takes to change the norms and the inclinations of a culture at large. In addition, polytheism in Mecca was part and parcel of the economic framework of the society. In other words, the Quraysh and the elite of the Arabs benefited greatly from tribes having their own gods and having those gods placed at the Kaaba and coming for visitation from time to time and spending money in the markets, etc., etc. In other words, it was not just a theological quibble. It was not just an argument over ideas, and it was not just a cultural change. It was also one man over and against an entire economic system, as well as a cultural system, And as we know in our lives today, looking at various movements in America in the past 30, 40 years, anybody trying to challenge the economic framework or the economic norms of a society is going to be given the harshest of punishments. Some scholars mention that Martin Luther King wasn't really persona non grata until he started talking about the economic woes or the economic injustices in America. So race was one thing, but then when he began talking about the economy, that's what really shakes the rich at the top of the iceberg. And so the Prophet went full head, full force against an economic enterprise. And so it wasn't, again, just a matter of preaching ideas. He came to teach materialistic Arabs, people with a shallow understanding of the way the cosmos works, about the fact that their actions demand retribution and accounting on the Day of Judgment. Whereas some of the Arabs believed that they were simply material bodies and that time would overtake them and then they would rot in the ground and there would be dust, never to be heard from again. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Maliki Yawmiddin. He is the owner and master of the Day of Judgment, of Yawmul Hisab, that He will account, He will take you to account and take me to account for all of the good and the bad that we've done. And this is really one of the core messages of Islam, because once you understand that each action that you do, and even each inclination you have in your soul, will be taken into account for, that will shift the way you decide to be in this world. One story that one of my teachers shared, he said that there was a companion of the Prophet who the Prophet asked to teach a new convert the Quran. And he taught him the verses that one who does an ounce of good in this world, he will see it. And one who does an ounce of evil in this world, he will see it. And he only taught him a couple of ayat, and that ayah was in the midst of it, the ayahs that he was teaching him. And this new Muslim said, that's enough for me, that's all I need to know. Because it hit him at his heart. And so this companion of the Prophet that was told to go and teach this new convert, he went to the Prophet and told him, I tried to teach him more, but he didn't want any more. And so you would think the Prophet would say, no, go pressure him to get some more teaching. But the Prophet said, this is a faqih. This is somebody who has deep knowledge of the religion in such a quick instant, because his heart was open to the message and understood the core of the message, that each one of our actions will be accounted for, and we'll have to face it, we'll have to see it. Any bit of good that we do, we will see it, we will be rewarded. Any bit of evil we'll do, we will see it, and we may have to face the punishment and wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To teach that to a materialistic society, or a society that didn't understand that your actions have repercussions for your own self, especially repercussions eternally speaking, is a major, major undertaking. Of course, we know that the Prophet came and taught that no Arab is superior to a non-Arab. And for the Arabs, this was a difficult thing to hear. And of course, he also taught that no non-Arab is superior to an Arab. And so to shift the way the community thought in terms of the hierarchy of who is better and who is an underclass, again, we see that people who undertake that in our own time, just in terms of US, is a major undertaking. Those who try to say that for all of the world, as the Prophet ﷺ did, it's an even more major undertaking. Of course, he also taught that the weak, the poor, the people who are mustada'af, these people ought to be given charity. These people ought to be given mercy and kindness. In our ahkam, in our rulings of Islamic Sharia, we'll find this coming up over and over again in some of our rules. And I'm mentioning this, it seems a little bit random, but I'm mentioning it to make a point. But for instance, when we have a wedding, it's recommended to have a walima after the wedding. The walima is a meal that you feed the community members as a celebration of your own wedding. one of the rules of that walima, of giving that meal, that party we could say, is that it's makruh, it's really heavily disliked if you don't invite people who are poor there. If you only invite wealthy people or perhaps even middle class people, if there's nobody that's destitute at your walima, this is considered a bad thing. And so the Prophet tried to raise kind of the bottom, lower rungs of the socioeconomic ladder, tried to raise that up with his teachings. Again, like we mentioned before, that's going to get the ire and the wrath of the people on top, the top 1% or whatever it is we want to say in our own society. And so in thinking about this and reflecting on this, we have to understand that that's a huge undertaking and that the Prophet suffered immensely for it. And without going into any detail, we know that the Prophet was outcast by his society in Mecca in particular, and that the Muslim community as a whole was basically boycotted for several years. Despite that, the Prophet pushed through, the Mecca was conquered, Muslim community began to settle in and began to grow. But then within a matter of just 50 years after the Prophet ﷺ had passed, there was a need for a new hero to rise up. Perhaps that's the secret of Husaynun minni wa ana min Husayn. The Prophet's social teachings, spiritual teachings, theological teachings were decaying by the moment over those 50 years. And 50 years is not a very long time. And we can look at this from several different angles. There's various reasons why that may have happened. For one, the Muslim boundaries, the Muslim community was growing. The Muslim empire had grown. There were new converts, people from different societies, people that were used to different religious backgrounds were coming into the fold of the deen. And so naturally you're going to get some rub-off of different ideas coming into the deen and disintegrating. Power was rested in people's hands that ought not to have had that power. Because when you have a social movement as Islam is, and a spiritual movement as Islam is, you need the best person to lead that movement, especially if your community is growing at such an alarming rate as the early Muslim community grew. And so, in particular, if we look at the 22 years of rule of Muawiyah's rule, the beginning of the Umayyad state, that is where we see a real jump of the Islamic core begun to crumble in terms of ideas, in terms of values. Inshallah, in the next couple of nights, we'll look at what exactly the Umayyad state did to kind of chip away at the Prophet's teachings. But at any rate, with all of that, after 50 years, there was a need for a new hero. And Imam Hussein is that new hero. To sacrifice and bring back his grandfather's message. As he said, he's rising only to reform, revitalize, revivify the ummah of his grandfather. And that was the core of the reason for his movement. And so after the death of Muawiyah and the rise of Yazid as caliph in the year 60 after Hijrah, Imam Hussein set out to do just that. And so again, we gather each year to remind ourselves of the values of honor and sacrifice and piety. But again, that raises another set of questions. Are these majalis, these gatherings, this poetry, this lamentation, is this an Islamic concept? Or, as some people may say, is this just a cultural concept? Is this a tradition that comes out of the teachings of Islam itself? Or is this something that somebody made up along the way and somebody thought it was a good idea to continue? Or we may hear from outside of the Shi'i community that this is actually just a strange aberration, a strange set of customs practiced by a deviant sect. We hear this from within the community as well. That, oh, this is just a South Asian thing. Or, oh, this is just an Iranian thing. Or, oh, this is just an Arab thing. And partially that's because of the color the flavor, cultural flavor that these practices have developed with because of the social settings in which they developed in. So I'd like to look at trying to analyze whether or not these acts are part of the Islamic heritage in terms of there's some religious authority for them, or are they part of the Islamic heritage just in terms of a cultural tradition that can be cast aside if we want to or not. So there are actually two tools that the Ahlul Bayt that came after Imam al-Hussein used to teach about the message of Karbala. The first of those two is Ziyarah, and we'll look at what that means. And the second of those two is poetry. So, spoiler alert, this is part of the Imamic framework. These gatherings are part of the Imam's heritage. So it's a pure, quote-unquote, pure Islamic custom to gather for the mourning of Hussein. And I want to look at how it is that the Imams practiced this, what it is they said, and maybe we can talk a little bit over dinner as part of the growth of our community in America about how we can actually make this tradition part and parcel of our land and our culture and our language. So the Imams, alayhim salam, pushed a culture of remembrance of Imam Hussein to deepen the Muslims' connection to the values of Imam Hussein's revolution. And these were not pushed simply as rituals to do each and every year. Our gatherings are not empty rituals. In English, we say we do that ritually. But they're meant to be infused with meaning. And these gatherings are meant to transform us over the course of the next year until the next Muharram season. And that we should take away something from these gatherings, from these reflections on the poetry that we listen to, that should change the way we act over the course of the next year. And the Imams used two tools primarily, like we mentioned, to do this, Ziyarah and poetry. Before we get into what Ziyarah is, we should also remember that this was all done within a context of religious and political repression. When we think of poetry for Imam Hussein or majalis for Imam Hussein, we think of it in the terms that we do it. And in our terms, there's no one really bothering us, knocking on our door, telling us don't do that anymore. There's relative allowance and freedom for us to hold our gatherings the way we'd like to. But you have to think about the time of Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam. His father had just been killed. Imam Hussein had just been killed. Yet, we have reports that during Imam Zain al-Abidin, the son of Hussein, during his lifetime, he had already begun visiting Karbala and doing ziyarah, visiting the graves of the shuhada and the martyrs of Karbala. That is not a light thing, because the Umayyads were still in power. Yazid was still around, and then his successors thereafter, and they still had an interest in keeping quiet the revolution of Imam Hussein. And they did this in two primary ways. The first way they did this was through deflection. In other words, the scholars of the Umayyad court would say that this was not, Yazid didn't do this. Yazid didn't do this. It was Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad that did this, the governor of Kufa. And the reason why the Umayyad court had to say this was because there was shock and revulsion at the killing of the Prophet's grandson by the larger Muslim community, not just the people who had a particular affiliation with the Ahlul Bayt at the time. But people knew who Imam Hussein was. There were stories about how Imam Hussein used to play on the back of our noble prophet when he was in prayer. People knew that Hussein was a noble person. And so the Umayyad court had to say, actually, it wasn't the Caliph. It wasn't Amir al-Mu'mineen, quote-unquote, Yazid. They had to keep his air of sanctity alive. So that they said it was actually the governor. It was Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. Thank you very much. And In doing so, of course, we have to think about what's the response to that. Maybe it was Ibn Ziyad. Perhaps it was. It wasn't Yazid. Well, besides the traditions and narrations and historical events that indicate that Yazid did horrific things to Imam Hussein's decapitated head, we also know that he did not take Ibn Ziyad to account for anything. Typically, if you're a ruler and you appoint a governor somewhere, and the governor does something egregious, then you take that person to account and you punish him. You take him down from his post, you might throw him in prison, whatever. But there's no indication that Yazid did anything of this sort. So the attempt to deflect responsibility from Yazid falls on its face. The second thing that the Umayyad regime did to try to repress the aspirations of the Husseini movement was to distort the intentions of Imam Hussein. And what they would say was that Imam Hussein did this for materialistic reasons. And he did this because he wanted power. In general, those claims fell flat on their face from the outset. Because again, people had a sense of who Imam Hussein was. Also, people had experienced 22 years of Umayyad rule already. They were already familiar with kind of Muawiyah's tactics of repressing any attempt of praise of Ahlul Bayt. They knew about how Muawiyah instituted the cursing of Imam Ali in various masajid. But I say this just to indicate that this imamic movement to continue the movement of Imam Hussein was done within a violent and a repressive moment. So, Ziyarah. What is Ziyarah? Ziyarah is the physical, bodily pilgrimage to one of the shrines of a holy personality. The Prophet, the Imams, Lady Fatima, Lady Masuma in Qum, Sayyidah Zainab in Damascus, and various holy personages that have shrines dedicated to them throughout the Muslim world. Even if they're not part of Ahlul Bayt, there are various sages and saints, and Ziyarah is part of Muslim culture. But the roots of Ziyarah comes from, and the real push for Ziyarah comes from the Imams that come after Imam Hussein. And there are various texts that are proof texts for that, to indicate that this is not some outside cultural, Christian act or Christian ritual that somehow seeped into the Islamic framework. Rather, we have a hadith from the Imams themselves indicating that you ought to do Ziyarah. So in a tradition from Imam Musa al-Kadhim, alayhi salam, we read that he says, the least reward for one who makes a visitation to Imam al-Hussein on the banks of the Euphrates, while he recognizes the Imam's right and his sanctity and his authority as an Imam, is that all of his past sins and all of his later sins will be forgiven. So there's Imam Musa saying, if you go and you do this, a lifetime of disobedience will be eliminated from your soul. And potentially, the rest of your lifetime of disobedience will be removed from your soul. And you'll meet your Creator with a clean heart. So this is, for a Muslim, for a believer, for somebody who believes that their soul will be taken into account at the Day of Judgment, there's no reward better than that. To not have to face God's wrath. So we see that Imam Musa is trying to push people, go to Karbala, make the bodily journey, visit Imam al-Hussein. The other thing we have to keep in mind when we see these ahadith is that for us, we live in an age of jet travel. So to get to Karbala, it might be a 15, 16-hour uncomfortable flight. But then after that, you get on a bus, you move forward. It's not that big of a deal. But in the context of the Imams, we're talking about people putting together provisions for weeks or perhaps months at a time, preparing food, preparing their clothing, putting them on pack animals, on camels and horses, and moving across through desert heat to get to the Imam. To get to the Imam's shrine. This isn't even going to visit a living Imam. A living Imam is saying, go visit his shrine. Go visit his great heat. And undertake, going to our next point, undertake the eyes and the spies of the Umayyad regime and of later the Abbasid regime. Because, again, the context we mentioned earlier is a context of repression. So as the authorities of the Umayyad regime became aware of this movement of Ziyarah, they began to set up garrisons along the roads that were commonly used to go visit Karbala, and they would man those garrisons with soldiers. And so there was always the threat of imprisonment. There was the threat of losing one's wealth, the threat of never seeing one's family ever again, and perhaps the threat, in certain circumstances, of death itself. So despite that, did the Imam still tell people, go visit the shrine of Al-Hussein? And the answer is yes. We have a hadith from Imam al-Baqir, alayhi salam. And that's early. That's early. Sallu ala Muhammad wa alihi. So the grandson of Al-Hussein, al-Baqir, told people, asked somebody, are you going to the tomb of Imam Hussein? And this companion of his, Muslim ibn Muhammad, says, yeah, I'm going to go, but I'm doing it in fear and with dread, because he feared the authorities at the time. Imam al-Baqir didn't say, so don't go then. He didn't say, don't worry about it. He didn't say, do it from your home. He didn't say, go to the rooftop and do it from the rooftop. He said, the more intense your fear and dread, then the more your reward will be for undertaking the pilgrimage to Imam Hussein. So again, this ziyarah is a revolutionary act in that it is going over and against a rebellion against the ruling regime at the time, during the Umayyad period, and also continuing into the Abbasid period. For the Abbasids, the Caliph al-Mutawakkil actually destroyed the shrine that had been set up for Imam al-Hussein. And he basically used people to plow it over, and then they filled it with water, and they burnt the building that was there. Yet still, the Shia would move forward and go toward Karbala. And so the nature of the visitation, the nature of Ziyarah, and the hardship, especially at the time, of the bodily hardship, and the time that it would take to get to the shrine at Karbala, perhaps gave one time and opportunity to feel the fear that the companions at Karbala felt, and to reflect on the real immensity and profundity and power of Imam Hussein's radical no to the ruling caliph at the time. For those, of course, unable to take that bodily journey, there are rich ziyarat texts of ziyarah that you recite as if you were in the shrine, that you can also do from your home. It is recommended to do it from a rooftop if possible, or to do it from the time they would say in the desert, but maybe for us it would be in a field or something like that. To point to Al-Hussein, toward Karbala, and to recite various ziyarat texts which bring the believer back to pledging allegiance to their Imam. I'd just like to read just one small fragment from one of the ziyarahs. It says, O God, ordain faith for me and confirm it in my heart. O God, make what I say with my tongue a reality in my heart, and a religious precept in my actions. O God, make me one of those who have a firm footing with Al-Hussein, and establish me among those who are martyred with him. So these ziyarah texts are encapsulations of what the believer's aspirations in life ought to be. Aspiration of being on the plains of Karbala had we been there. The hope that we wouldn't have been like the majority of the community who didn't have the bravery or the insight or the foresight to join the Ahlul Bayt in this revolution. The second tool that we mentioned that the Imams use to encapsulate and concretize the message of Imam al-Hussein is that of poetry. The Imams encouraged lamentations for Imam Hussein as well as praise of Ahlul Bayt, especially toward the end of the Umayyad period. For poetry was seen as a vehicle for teaching high morals, and the Imams, the high morals of the Imams rather, and of the tragedy of Karbala. And we have various reports from the Imams. Again, this is not a cultural creation that came later. This was during the period of the Imamic period. The Imams would encourage people, encourage poets to recite, and indeed they would invite poets to their own homes and ask them to recite for them. In fact, we even have at least one hadith that indicates that Imam al-Baqir wanted to pay one of the poets that he had invited to recite for him. Of course, the poet said, "No, thank you, please pray for me." And then al-Baqir said that your reward will be with Allah. But there was this idea that in seeing this hadith, we see that the Imam wanted to encourage this even with monetary power. To pay people as a way of encouragement is kind of getting at their base desires, their base needs, and to encourage people with something immediate. Money immediately is something that would instantiate the lamentation of Al-Hussein through poetry more effectively and more immediately. So we have this interesting hadith from a poet named Abu Harun. And he says that Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, he invited me to recite in his home. He says, Imam Sadiq said, "Abu Harun, recite to me about Al-Hussein." And so Abu Harun says, I recited, and the Imam wept. And then the Imam said, or Abu Harun said, the Imam told me, "But no, recite like you were reciting before." And you have to pause when you're reading this hadith, and you have to say, what does that mean? And Abu Harun in the hadith actually clarifies. He's saying that the Imam was telling him to recite with vigor, with emotion, with sadness. Perhaps Abu Harun, out of shyness or out of respect for the Imam, became more formal, but the Imam was apparently familiar with the way Abu Harun used to recite. He said, "Recite the way you usually recite." Then Abu Harun says, "So I recited more." And the Imam wept more. And the Imam said, "Recite more." And so he recited, he says, "I recited another ode." And the Imam wept. And I heard weeping from behind the curtain. Presumably there were women in Imam Hussein's home. He said, "I heard weeping from behind the curtain. And when I had finished, the Imam told me, 'Abu Harun, whoever recites poetry about Al-Hussein and weeps and makes 10 other people weep, heaven is decreed for him,'" for the poet. "And whoever recites poetry about Al-Hussein and he weeps and he makes one other person weep, then heaven is decreed for both of those people." So again, we see the Imams using the promise of eternal reward as encouragement for remembrance of Imam al-Hussein and his movement. Some scholars who study these ahadith note that perhaps the reason for this high reward, you recited some poetry, you made somebody cry, so you're going to get heaven like that? It seems simple. Some of the ulama have said that perhaps the reason for this is because the poets at this period, in the Umayyad and the Abbasid period, were still part of kind of political culture. We might think of the poets of that time like maybe the bloggers in some of the more repressive countries today. We'll hear about blogger so-and-so was arrested in such and such country because he said something that was politically unsavory. The poets in the Umayyad and the Abbasid times were part of political culture. And so the authorities always kept an eye and kept tabs on what poets were saying. So when we analyze these ahadith, we actually see that the Imams would tell people to gather kind of secretly. So these gatherings that we have openly here would have been kind of done as an underground movement, so to speak. The Shia movement in general was kind of underground for many, many years. And so poets who maybe wanted to be popular, they wouldn't necessarily say, I have an affiliation with Ahlul Bayt. So they would keep their quote-unquote radical Ahlul Bayt-centric Husseini poetry under wraps a little bit. And the Shia would also do this secretly at night. Keeping that context in mind helps us to understand really how radical and how interesting the Imamic push for Ziyarah in poetry really was. And as the Shia community developed over time, these lamentations became part and parcel. This poetry became part and parcel of the spiritual and intellectual fabric of the Shia community. And in some contexts we see, even today, that spills out into the broader Muslim community as well. Where you'll see in South Asia, you'll see in Lebanon, Sunnis will join Shias for commemoration of Imam Hussein. And this is all part of the legacy of the Imamic push to kind of popularize. There's one thing to have, political manifestos that only a couple people read here and there. But once you create that political manifesto and you instantiate it and put it into poetry, put it into something that the masses will enjoy, put it into something that everybody can understand and connect to, that's a genius move. And that was the move of the Ahlul Bayt. That means that we have a requirement as kind of an Anglophile, English-speaking community, an American community. We have an obligation, I think, to begin to create powerful poetry and other forms of lamentation and commemoration of the Imam's movement in a way that resonates with us, that jives with us, in a way that moves us. Because it's part of the miracle of language that a couplet of poetry or a lyric from a song can push somebody to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. It will give them power and courage. You have military couplets, you have marching songs, and these are all things to drive the human spirit towards something they wouldn't typically move toward. And the encapsulation or the reason for this poetry is to move toward enjoining good and forbidding evil no matter what the cost. Imam Hussein's cost was, of course, his family. Imam Hussein also lost the Islamic community of the Muslim world to give bay'ah, to pledge allegiance to Yazid himself. And so he ordered the governor of Medina to get bay'ah from both Imam Hussein and also Ibn Zubayr, as these were two prominent companions, or one Ahlul Bayt individual and a prominent companion of sorts, the son of a prominent companion. But they were noblemen. And as we know, Imam Hussein did not pledge allegiance to Yazid. He retorted to the Medinan governor that the likes of me doesn't pledge allegiance to the likes of him, to the likes of Yazid. A pious individual, somebody that's a grandson of the Prophet, does not pledge allegiance to an open sinner, to somebody who apparently was an open drinker, and all sorts of other strange stories about his lack of moral character. So Imam al-Hussein moved from Medina and he left for Mecca. And sometimes in retelling these stories, we lose the historical time frame. So I'll just mention that Imam Hussein was in Mecca for about 4 months after his move from Medina. And during that time period, he began to receive many letters from the people of Kufa, which indicates something important. Why would Imam Hussein start getting random letters from people in Kufa? Well, after the death of Muawiyah, there was already a sense of anti-Umayyad sentiment in the Muslim community. There was already a sense that we didn't like Muawiyah. We've moved to Yazid, but we don't like Yazid. We need somebody else. And so the Kufans began to write to Imam al-Hussein and ask him, come to Kufa. We are with you. We will help you to overtake Kufa and create a state of power for you. the Kufan governor is weak. We can do this. So then Imam Hussein decides, I'm going to send an envoy, an ambassador to Kufa to find out if these letters are even true. Are these forged letters? Are these real letters? Can we trust these people of Kufa? And so Imam Hussein writes a letter back before he sends Muslim to Kufa, and in brief, a segment of that letter says this. Imam Hussein wrote to them and says, I am sending you my brother and my cousin, and the man from my family who I trust, Muslim ibn Aqil. I have ordered him to write to me about your status, condition, and opinion. If he writes to me that the opinion of the majority of you and of the men of wisdom and merit among you is united, in the same way as the messengers who have come to me have described it, meaning the same way that the letters seem to indicate, and as I have read in your letters, then I will come to you speedily, if Allah wills. For by my life, an imam is no one but one who acts according to the book of Allah, upholds justice, follows the truth, and devotes himself entirely to Allah. So he sends Muslim. It's a couple of weeks' journey. He goes from Mecca to Medina, and then from Medina, he takes off to Kufa. And when he enters Kufa, again, for historical context, he's in Kufa for a while. This is not a quick thing. He's in Kufa, and he begins meeting the people who had given Imam Hussein the promise of allegiance. And this becomes an open fact. People know about this, including the governor. The governor, however, was not able to stamp out the beginnings of this revolt, this revolution that's impending. So some people write to Yazid and tell Yazid, look, your Kufan governor, he can't deal with this thing that Muslim is doing. Things are bubbling up too quickly here. Yazid sends Ubaydullah bin Ziyad. Ubaydullah bin Ziyad is a ferocious person. He is a brutal individual. And one of the narrated speeches that he gave, it is said that he said this: beware of opposition and spreading rumors. This is Ibn Ziyad. Beware of opposition and spreading rumors. By him beside who there is no deity, by God. If I am informed of any opposition from you, then I will certainly kill him. I will kill anybody who knows that person, and I will kill that person's family. This is a wretch. Verily, I will punish severely for even the slightest act of disobedience, until you totally submit to me, and there remains among you no opponent or opposer. So this is the climate that Yazid is creating in Kufa. The political situation worsened. So all of a sudden, Muslim ibn Aqil needs to move into hiding. Ibn Ziyad sends out spies to find out, where is he anyway? That Muslim attempts kind of a show of power, and he moves with a bunch of men who had pledged allegiance to Imam Hussein, who had pledged that their swords would be with Muslim and with Imam Hussein into the future. And it is said in some narrations that he kind of marched out with about 4,000 men to the mosque in Kufa. And the well-known story is that they began Maghrib prayer together, and they prayed. The Muslim was leading the prayer. And then they prayed Salatul Isha, and they prayed. But when Muslim turned around, there was no one left with him. Those 4,000 men in the march to the mosque in Kufa, and in the midst of prayer, after their prayers had begun to disperse, the families of those individuals came to them and said, look, somebody else will stand in your place. Don't sacrifice yourself. Don't risk it. Mothers would come to their sons, come home. Don't risk this. Wives would come to their husbands and say, don't go. Don't risk this. All of a sudden, the power of the thousands, some narrations say 18,000 pledges of allegiance to Imam Hussein began to vanish within the midst of two prayers that we just prayed tonight. And so Muslim was left alone. He's completely alone in a foreign land, and he's wandering around. His protector had already been taken into custody, Hani bin Urwa, and now he was looking for a place to stay. And in the midst of the streets of Kufa, an old woman notices him walking and asks him, "Are you Muslim?" And he says, "Yes, I am." And this woman has an affiliation, an inclination toward the Ahlul Bayt. So this old woman brings in Muslim ibn Aqil and insists that he stay in there for hiding, even though Muslim didn't want to put her in any danger. And so he comes in at her insistence. The problem is that her son was not fond of the Ahlul Bayt, was not fond of any revolution against Yazid. And so when her son realizes who is in their home, he goes and he alerts the authorities. And the next morning, the hooves of the horses of the police force of Ibn Ziyad woke Muslim ibn Aqil, and he readied himself for the battle. He realized that he would either be taken into custody or he would have to die. And it is narrated that the police force began to force their way into this old woman's home, and he unsheathed his sword and he fought valiantly against them. And he was outmatched, yet he still rebuffed their attacks until he got a slash of a sword across his face, which opened up his lip and which took out two of his bottom two teeth. You can imagine at that point, most of us would give up. We'd raise our hands and we'd go into custody. But Muslim didn't give up. But neither did the police force that came to take him into custody. At seeing Muslims' ferocity in battle, the soldiers of the police force began to take higher ground and began throwing stones at Muslim. At this point, he had come out of the home, and they began to light pieces of firewood and threw flaming projectiles at Muslim. And it is only after many minutes of battle, after an immense excursion of battle and exhaustion settled into Muslim's body, and one of the soldiers said, "You will be safe, we will not kill you," did finally Muslim surrender. He couldn't fight any longer. He was surrounded by the police force with their swords unsheathed at him. So he is taken to the palace of Ibn Ziyad, the governor's palace. He is taken in front of Ibn Ziyad, and Ibn Ziyad says, "Who was the first man that you hit with a sword?" And one of the police came forward and said, "I was the first to be hit by Muslim." So he says, "You have the honor of taking Muslim to the top of the governor's palace and killing him." Muslim says, "I was promised safety by one of your men, that you would not execute me." He says, Ziyad is a treacherous person. He says that has no merit here. Muslim asks that a letter be sent to Imam Hussein at least, and that his sword and his shield be given, they're sold, and his debts be repaid. Muslim is a man of taqwa. He's trying to take care of all of his obligations despite facing death. He was taken, his requests were not given. He was taken to the top of the palace, and his executioner reports that Muslim was mentioning the greatness of Allah and glorifying him and seeking Allah's forgiveness all the way up the stairs to the top of the building. And when I drew near to kill him, Muslim said to me, "O Allah, you judge between us and a people who lied to us, who deceived us, who deserted us and killed us." And the executioner told him, "Come closer to me." And he gave him one blow of the sword over the neck. Unfortunately, it did not get the job done. So brutally, the executioner raises his sword yet again, throws a second blow, decapitates Muslim, and throws his body off the top of the building. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Sallu ala Muhammad. Amin.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa